Yes, I started out at Borthwicks during school holidays to get a bit of extra pocket money like a lot of school kids did, and that was about 1948. And at the time I was around about 15, and I was with Ewan Urquhart was the main intake man there, and with the livestock. And our job was to unload the trains. Nearly all the livestock came in trains in those days because it was really before the big numbers of livestock transports were going. And the stock that came in was mainly sheep and lambs and also cattle. And in those days we used to get a lot of trains in from Alice Springs. They used to be mustered into Alice Springs and put on trains and came down into Adelaide, and then they were rested there for 2 or 3 days, and then they came through to Portland. There was other cattle as well, of course. And then there were pigs. We used to kill quite a few pigs in those days. And also chooks. Chooks were mainly seasonal. They came down in sheep vans, converted sheep vans, and they came mainly from Bendigo and Castlemaine, but they were seasonal, of course. I think it was usually March or April that they came through, but it was a big job, and being a kid, of course, they'd leg me up into a van and there'd be feathers and things flying everywhere, and there was always a few eggs on the, on the floor of the vans. It used to be a scatter for those. And they also processed rabbits then too, but of course they didn't come in there in trains. They were always purchased by trucks that went around the districts. And then it was 1951, after I left school, Mr. Huey Keeler, who was manager at the time, he asked me if I'd like to become a cadet buyer, which I did in 1951, and I started there then as a cadet buyer, which entailed I went right through the works, doing every job on the works. That took about 3 or 4 months, and after that I went into the office, and I spent some time in the office, presumably about 3 or 4 months, learning accounts and costings and shipping and everything entailed in the office, general office procedures in a meat company. During that time I played football with Portland in Jack Condon's time. We were beaten by Hamilton in the grand final in 1951, and we got our own back in 1952, winning the premiership then. And it was then that I was moved to Mount Gambier under Mr. Neil Skingdon. He was the senior buyer there at the time. We had 4 buyers in Mount Gambier at that stage, and the job I was doing there mainly was the first season I was there was unloading trains. All the livestock used to come into Mount Gambier from Bordertown, Narracourt, Penola, Lucendale, Millicent on the narrow gauge, because they're only narrow gauge trains. So it was my job to organise drovers and men to unload the narrow gauge trains and reload them onto the broad gauge that went through to Portland. Sometimes we sent them through to South Brookland in Melbourne. They were mainly lambs during the season, from probably September through to December. And we loaded transferred a train load every day and 2 every Saturday. Mainly about 35 rail trucks consisting of about 5,000 lambs per train. So I didn't get a day off between October and Christmas. But I enjoyed it. It was a good life then. And then I started buying pigs and bobby calves, and then as I progressed, I was buying more lots of sheep and lambs in the paddock and cattle, and also doing the smaller sales, and gradually buying more and more. And then coming over to Casterton and Coleraine through that area. And as we had Mr. Len Turner in Hamilton at the time, and he was getting older and frailer, and I was gradually taking over a bit more of his work. So in 1962 I moved to Casterton to live with my wife and young family. And Casterton in those days had a cattle sale every fortnight. Denny Lascelles selling one Thursday, and then elders and young husbands selling on the other fortnight. So there were a sale every fortnight. Also sales I did were Strathdowney, Lake Mundy, Durgam, Tarryukin, Coleraine. They were fortnightly in between the Casterton sales. And then of course there was Merino once a month, and Digby occasionally. But of course we've seen the demise probably of all those little sales.
Yeah, that's something we're telling in this story, Bill, is the story of all these little sale outs, which is great.
Right.
You put this into it.
Yeah.
You keep at it.
Some of those sales were only seasonal, but others were regular. Then we moved on, and the livestock were hard to move in those days because there were the transports were only smaller and there weren't many of them, and so nearly all the stock had to be moved and delivered to railheads. And while I was still living in Mount Gambier, I used to have to come over to Sandford, and we used to load special trains out of Sandford going to Portland, and some to South Brooklyn with sheep and lambs. They were usually, once again, similar to the Mount Gambier size. They were usually 5,000 head a time. We did walk sheep from Casterton sale yards here, the sheep that I bought. Dick Smith and his crew walked sheep to Portland on quite a few occasions. But then prior to that too, I didn't mention, but before my time, out of Mount Gambier, they used to walk lambs from Mount Gambier to Portland. It's pretty hard to believe, but it definitely happened. And they used to walk them out through Strathdowney and then across the bridge at Dartmoor and down that way. There was one time when Nils Kingdon bought about 5,000 lambs from Mount Shank Station from Mr. Trevor Clark. And they were going to walk, they decided they'd walk those to Portland through Nelson. Well, the old Nelson Bridge, for those that remembered it, were very narrow and wooden and rattly. And I think they were about 2 days trying to get the mob over the bridge. And then, of course, that was the time that Alan Scott had just come to Mount Gambier. He worked himself, of course, he had an old 160 International with a 22 or 24 foot tray, semi-trailer tray, and that was regarded as a fairly big truck in those days. So you can see the difficulty that we had in moving stock. Then gradually the livestock numbers increased everywhere, mainly because I think of the land clearing and better pastures and better farming practices throughout, heavier, I beg your pardon? Superphosphate, yes, and heavier stocking rates, which that superphosphate allowed. And so we were kept busier and busier. But during the 1960s late 50s and right through the 60s and early 70s, all the meat companies made a large amount of money. They made big profits. And their failure, or Borthwick's failure in my opinion, was that they didn't put enough back into their works, both in Portland and in South Brooklyn. The Portland works were originally built, I understand, by a farmers' co-op in somewhere around 1906 or 1908, I think. And I'm not too sure the year that Borthwicks took that over, but the co-op just couldn't keep going. Borthwicks took it over in somewhere about 1912 or 14, just prior to the First World War. And there was a lot of that work still standing and being used right through the 70s and 80s. And the works in general, any money it spent on it was just tacked on, and there was never enough money spent on the works. So the demise gradually went down. I think there were other problems. Sometimes the live sheep shipments were brought in as an excuse, but I think it was only an excuse. There was union pressure, of course, that was pretty rife through the late 70s and 80s. And then Mr. L.G. Borthwick, he was the brains of the sales side of the whole Borthwick empire, and he was killed in a head-on crash in London at the time, and the company never really got over his death. A replacement really wasn't found that was good enough. And then, of course, as I've mentioned, the works were old and out of date. And then a lot of mismanagement came into the company. So then it was they were looking to sell it for some time, and then eventually Australian Meat Holdings they purchased the Borthwicks Australian setup, of which Portland was one, of course. I think they bought it mainly for the cattle works and cattle stations in Queensland. And then, of course, they only had it some, I think about 12 months, and then they shut Portland down and gradually sold it off. So that was basically the end of the works in Portland. Some of the when AMH closed Portland down, they were good to me, and they gave me a farewell dinner, which was much appreciated in Portland. And during that dinner, that somebody had gone through all the books in the thing, and they worked out that I'd bought 11.8 million sheep and lambs for Borthwicks while I was employed by them. Some of the biggest single purchases I made the biggest was 14,400 from Mr. John Barlew at Yarram Park. That was during the 1967 drought. We had to take delivery of those over about 3 weeks to a month because of the difficulty in moving that number of sheep in those days. We had all transports that we could muster, shuttling them back and forth for approximately 3 weeks, I would say. The other single big purchase I made was